right, so this is my presentation on the Great Apostasy from Unit 2 by Josh Westbrook. So the two academic sources I use is Twilight in the Early Church by Jeffrey Marsh and The Process of Apostasy in the New Testament and the Book of Mormon by Daniel L. Belknap. So in this, I'm not going to read this, but basically he talks about how the Greek philosophy in the early church, it infiltrated them, and people in the early Christian church started adopting like Greek philosophy, like idol worship, things like that. And then in this article, he talks about in the New Testament, people start claiming false authority and claiming that they are false Christs. And so it led a lot of people away from the church and caused a lot of confusion in the true church as well. And so we see that in the restorative church as well. Early on, you see similar things happen as well. And the prophetic talks that I use are More Than a Philosophy by Hugh B. Brown and The Only Name Given Under Heaven by Milton R. Hunter. So basically he says, the Church of England and other Protestant churches frankly admit the fact of the apostasy. To summarize, he says basically there's original church, and all the other Reformed churches are also false as well if the original church wasn't even true. And so by that, we already know that there was a great apostasy, and Reformers, they admit that there was an apostasy in the early church. Okay, and the only name given under heaven, the early Christian Reformers broke away from the Catholic Church because of numerous man-made false doctrines, teachings, and practices that had corrupted the entire organization during the period of the Great Apostasy. So this goes back to kind of the same thing as how Greek philosophy infiltrated the early church, and people started believing the doctrines from the Greeks, and it kind of intermingled with the original church. And that's how we slowly fell away from the true doctrine from before as well. Okay, and the D&C sections I used was section 1, 15 to 16, and 86.3. To summarize, basically, it talks about idol worship again, is people strayed away from the original doctrine, and they started bringing in idols because the Greeks were a culture of idol worshipers, and that's how it became also intermingled in there as well. And also in 86.3, this gives an analogy of the wheat and the tares. Basically, originally it was all wheat, and then after the apostles after they died, Satan began sowing in tares, and eventually they grew and overran the wheat, and there was no more wheat. Basically, it's an analogy of the early church and the apostles and true doctrine. And Joseph Smith Papers quote, Lucy Mack Smith talks about, if there is an evil in this congregation which is not repented of, will result in apostasy. So basically we see this in the early church during Christ's time as well. People started straying away, and they weren't repenting, and that led to apostasy. We see that in the restorative early church as well. People started leading away other people from the church, but luckily we're blessed to have apostles and prophets that were kept alive. So in summary, the Great Apostasy was a very real thing. A lot of the other reformers, they know this as well, especially the Lutherans. They admit that there was an apostasy because Martin Luther wrote a statement of things that were wrong with the Catholic Church, and he recognized that there was an apostasy. And the second point is that prophets and apostles are essential in keeping the church in the right path. We can see that once the apostles and prophets were killed, there was no one to receive revelation and guide the church in the right direction. And also how it's relevant to us today. Obviously, the more we rely on the teachings of apostles and prophets, because we do live in a polarized society, it's getting a lot harder and harder to stay on the right path. And obviously, the more we heed the counsel from prophets and apostles, the more likely we are to stay in the church and not apostatize from the church. And so that is my presentation.